Welcome to Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're in the series Critical Thinking Skills in Science, and we're in Chapter 11, Non-Western Critical Thinking, Session number 6. In this series that we're leading up to building the house, we started with the cultural factor, 0. Then we put in the foundation number 1, which is the source of reliable knowledge. Then we had the four pillars of faith, of the Hebrews' faith. And now we're on the floor now, the second floor, that represents a practical system of action, not just a system of thought. A system of thought would be more Greek, more Western. And so in this floor represents a practical system of action that are governed by man's relationship to God. And what does that mean? All through the scriptures, God instituted a pattern of how man was to relate to him and how he was to relate to man. What were the two obligations? And what these are called covenants. And so the Hebrew term berith means covenant. The usage of the term berith is primarily used to denote a covenant, which is a solemn agreement or contract between two parties. In the biblical context, it often refers to the divine covenants established by God with humanity, such as the covenants with Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, etc. Okay, so how did God relate to man? Was through covenant agreements. You do this, I'll do that. I'll do that, you do this. And then they are bound to be steadfast, loyal, and fulfill each one their side of the deal. Cultural and historical background of covenants. In the ancient Near Eastern context, covenants were common, legal agreements that could be made between individuals, tribes, or nations. They were often ratified by a ceremony that included sacrifices, symbolizing the seriousness and binding nature of the agreement. So in the Middle East, in this time, covenants were often made and used between different groups of people. So it's not strange for God to have had covenants with the Hebrew nation at that time, because the Hebrew nation saw other covenants among other groups, and that those covenants were binding. One that's not mentioned as a real covenant, but it in a way it was, is the first covenant. And I'm not going through all the covenants. I'm only going through specific covenants that impinge upon what we are talking about and about in this context. The first covenant is Adam, is that God made a covenant with Adam. And that covenant consisted of one rule, okay? One rule to be obedient to. Do not eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so here's the deal. This is the start of the human race, and God makes his first covenant with man, and he's taking it pretty easy on him because he's going for one, just one rule to the covenant, okay? And God says, I promise to take care of you. I'm giving you a garden. I'm giving you everything you need for your sustenance. I'm going to take care of you. But there's one rule, okay? There's one tree that I put in the middle of the garden. And it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I don't want you to eat of it. Don't eat of it. That's the only rule, and that's it, okay? What happened? He ate, okay? And by eating it, he broke the covenant. He broke faithfulness. He broke the steadfastness. He broke the commitment that he had to his God. He ate. And it's not that it was a certain type of fruit or that that he was prohibited from touching it or looking at it or what. It was a rule. And that's the only rule that God had. And that the day that you eat from it, you will die. Well, Adam didn't know what death was. But what the death that God was talking about, when Adam ate of it, he died spiritually. He died physically too, in a way, in that his clock started running and that he was no longer to live forever, and he was no longer had access to the tree of life that could have made him live forever. But instead, he died spiritually, and he was separated from God's presence. That's the death spiritually. He was separated from God, and that is the death. So that's the first covenant, and it only had one rule, and it was don't do this. Don't eat of that one tree in the middle of the garden. I don't know how many other trees there might have been, but I imagine that God had a representative of every kind that he had created, and that there was plenty there to pick from and to eat from, minus the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I'm sure there was a lot of different options, but they ate from the one that was the only prohibited option and broke that covenant. There was another covenant that God made, and there's been several, but the Abrahamic covenant, where he promised that Abraham's seed was to be his nation, that from Abraham would rise a nation that would be God's possession. And God would put his possession, his people, in a certain location in the land of Canaan, that he would give them that land as their own. And in exchange, he was to be their God, their only God, not one God among others, worshiping him and others. That nullifies the whole contract. He is a jealous God, and only he should be worshipped and can be worshipped. And this covenant was ratified by circumcision. And so, in other words, it was blood, it was cut, but it was on Abraham's part that they were circumcised. They had to submit to circumcision, which meant their amen to the contract, to the covenant. Another covenant, the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic law, God gave them laws now when they came out of Egypt as an unruly group that did not know God, did not know what God expected from them, did not know. And so 50 days out of Egypt, they're on Mount Sinai, or around the base of it. Moses goes up the mount because he's called by God. God has called Moses to come up, and that God wants to give him the ordinances and the laws that these people need to follow to be his people. And so it is the Mosaic law, and the Mosaic law is composed of 10 statements. That's in Hebrew. Hebrew is 10 statements, which is close to a Greek term that maybe you've heard is the Decalogue, the Mosaic Decalogue, which is 10 statements. And so they aren't necessarily the 10 commandments to the Hebrews. They're 10 statements that in summary represent the total of 613 ordinances or commandments. So now we go from Adam that had one law, one request, one prohibition. and he failed. So now God institutes a new covenant. And I'm giving you 613 of them now. And it's kind of like God never expected them to complete with all 613. What they were there for was to show what God expected and what they could not do, what they could not fulfill. And that's why the sacrificial system was instituted, because they were aware of their sin. They were aware of what they could not do because of the law, because of the ordinances that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai and ratified by blood that was sprinkled upon the tablets and upon the congregation. And they said, the people, when Moses came down, we will do everything that God has commanded. Amen. Okay, so they willingly submitted to this God. Why? Because he had just delivered them through power, through wonders, through signs. They had crossed the Red Sea, not the Reed Sea that was, whatever it was deep enough to drown the Egyptians. Anyway, they saw, and therefore they said, and they heard God on the mountain, rumbling and earthquakes and rock splitting and thunder and lightning and smoke. And it's kind of like, yeah, that would convince me that I submit. Yes, I will. But we can't do it through human agency. Even though we have the will, the flesh doesn't follow. The flesh is corrupted. So the Mosaic Law was instituted. That was a covenant. That was a relationship to relate man now to God. How was he to relate? Well, he also gave the temple, and he gave the sacrifice. He gave the Holy of Holies of where he resides. So at the same time he gave the law, he gave the temple. And so that people knew, or should have known, that it wasn't the law that made them perfect. It was the temple. It was the sacrifice that was given. And the sacrifices of everyday sacrifice was a reminder that the sacrifices weren't good enough. They had to be repeated daily, and that they did not take away the guilt of sin. So that was it was symbolic of what was to lead to the next covenant. Each covenant represented a relationship between God and man, and what each one's responsibility was to be. Okay, so we had the covenant, the Mosaic covenant of the law. But what's interesting is that, and Moses was not chosen to be the head of the priesthood. It was his brother Aaron. And so Aaron was chosen and his lineage to be the priesthood, whereas Moses was chosen to represent the law and that the order and what God expected from them. But Aaron represented what was coming, a spiritual side that required the shedding of blood. Exodus 19, verses 3 through 9. Moses went up to God, and Yahweh called to him out of the mountain, saying, "This is what you shall tell the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession from among all peoples, from all the earth, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel." Okay? God is going back over their deliverance, their history. "You know who I am," he says. "I'm the one that delivered you with a strong arm. I am the one that rescued you from the whole Pharaoh's army. I'm the one. So, and I want a holy nation. Holy is separate. I want a nation separate unto me, a nation that will be holy, a nation that will be faithful to me and steadfast, and I will be faithful and steadfast to them, the Enuma. So what happened? Well, we know what happened. Hosea chapter 6, verses 6 and 7. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Okay, they were sacrificing. But then after they sacrificed, they would go out and do their sin thinking the sacrifice has covered for it. And it's kind of like, that's not the way it operates. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. But they, like Adam, have broken the covenant. They were unfaithful to me. And this is kind of amazing because there's a lot of terminology in here in Enuma where we went over where Enuma meant nursing. It meant holding. It meant embracing. It meant supporting. It meant, and God is treating Israel like as if He was their protector. He was their father. And Israel is the wife. And Israel has been unfaithful to him. In many places, it calls Israel kind of acting like a harlot, acting like a prostitute, in that they come home at night and they burn offerings, sacrifice to God, but during the day, they're out playing around with other gods and with other loyalties that are breaking the trust and the loyalty of Enuma to God. And so this is where God says, Hosea chapter 6, verse 7, but they, like Adam, how are they like Adam? They broke the trust. Adam had one law, and you know, these guys did. They had 613 now, but what was the summary of the main law? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And the second's like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So in other words, God had one law. Love me. Be steadfast. Be committed to me. And I will be committed to you. I will not fail you. Don't fail me. Stick with me. And yet it says, but they, like Adam, have broken the covenant. They were unfaithful to me. They were unfaithful to me, and it goes on, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Okay, we're going to take this sentence out of the context of Hosea, and we're going to look at it. Say, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Okay, we're talking about critical thinking, so we're talking about knowledge, how to get to knowledge. And it says the knowledge of God. What is the Hebrew term used for knowledge there? It's dath, which definition means knowledge. Its meaning is knowledge, but dath comes from another word, which is dat, D-A-A-T, which means to know. And in the Hebrew language, to know did mean knowledge or know of surrounding things, but it was also the same term used between a husband and wife, as Adam knew his wife, Eve, and they had a child. So it's talking about intimate relationships that are really deep, in that this knowledge is to know God in a way that is deep, that is more than just learning, book learning. It is more than just hypothesizing or believing. It is a knowledge that is profound, a knowledge that is deep, a knowledge that is relational. And that's why we're looking at, okay, how can we apply critical thinking to get reliable knowledge? Critical thinking does not provide knowledge in this form as the Hebrews. And so, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. So in other words, God was more interested that they know him. And knowing means having an intimate relationship with, which means committed to, which means loyalty, which means just in a relationship that is reciprocal both ways. The usage of the term dath, as used by the Hebrew culture, or the Hebrews, the Hebrew word dath primarily refers to knowledge, understanding, or perception. It encompasses both intellectual comprehension and experiential knowledge. In the biblical context, dath often implies a deep, intimate understanding that goes beyond mere factual information, encompassing moral and spiritual dimensions. That is what God wanted. God wanted the Hebrew nation to know him, but not just know him by reciting the Shema or the laws or whatever. He wanted them to know him, not just knowledge, but knowledge of him. Cultural and historical background of dath. In ancient Hebrew culture, knowledge was not merely an accumulation of facts, but was closely tied to one's relationship with God and others. So again, knowledge is not to the Hebrews a Western concept of the accumulation of data. Maybe that's where we get data from dath. But anyway, to the Hebrews, knowledge was closely tied to one's relationship to God and to others. And so it goes very deep. It's relational. It's knowledge. It's knowledge that is not superficial, but knowledge that goes down very deep. The Hebrew concept of knowledge involved a holistic understanding that included wisdom, discernment, and the ability to apply what one knows in practical and ethical ways. Knowledge was seen as a gift from God, essential for living a life that is pleasing to him. Okay, so where did the Hebrews get their knowledge from? It was from God. How do you apply critical thinking to that? If you really believe in God, and you really believe there is a God, then the knowledge from him is supreme knowledge. It is the most reliable knowledge that exists. It's not just reliable or the most reliable, it is true knowledge. It is the truth. So for man to take his ability to think and apply critical thinking to the knowledge God has given him, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. Knowledge was seen as a gift, and that the Hebrew concept of knowledge involved a holistic understanding that included wisdom, discernment, and the ability to apply what one knows in practical and ethical ways. So knowledge was not book. Knowledge was fully rounded. It was holistic. It was complete. It was complete knowledge that functioned within that culture. We're getting a little different perspective of what the Hebrew perspective was of knowledge, and reliable knowledge at that. And what was their source? Their source was God. So we'll answer this a little later, but apply our critical thinking to it? At this juncture, I would say probably not a good concept, in that you probably could apply critical thinking to man-made knowledge because it's perishable. It's got a half-life to it. It turns out to be wrong every so many years. Yes, critical thinking is an instrument that would be very good on human-produced knowledge. but a knowledge that comes from God, subjected to human criteria and critical thinking, it's not an idea that entered the Hebrew cultural functioning. Thank you again. This is wrapping up on session 6, chapter 11 of non-Western critical thinking. Thank you again for accompanying me.